All right, here we go. Okay, couple things before we get started, just general stuff. Thing number one, if you turn in something really, really late, I'm talking 3-4 weeks late, will you send me an email that gives me a brief explanation of why? Like I had somebody turn in something a month late yesterday. If you're a month late on something, I got to know why. Even if it's just, I thought I turned it in, but I didn't, or I didn't realize we actually had to do the quiz or something like that. Just let me know so I kind of know what's going on. Okay, thing number two, I'm worried a little that you don't pay close attention or much attention during class. I get that I'm probably not the most fascinating person in the world to listen to, and that, you know, listening to a history lecture is probably not your thing. However, I'm getting some questions that make me think you're not, like you just log in and then you go away. So these are the questions that make me think that. Could you go over the weekly question, because I really don't know what you're asking me. Typically at the beginning of each class, I go over the weekly question. So if I get it, if I start doing that and you sort of tune out, or you got a kid and he's running around the room, or, you know, maybe the tree falls in the backyard, which happened to me one day in class, you know, something like that happens, I get it. Go back and look at the video. Or, you know, I'm not saying you can't email me and ask me a question, but could you go over the weekly question? I already do. So, you know, make sure that you're paying attention. Thing number three, I may have mentioned before, plagiarism is bad, still is. So if you turn in something that's completely copied from an online source, yeah, that's not good. So don't do that. Don't do that anymore, I guess I should say. So I can give you an F for the entire class for that. So, and I'll notice for a couple of reasons. One, there's a plagiarism check on your answers. So that's reason number one. Number two, I would notice anyway, especially on this last time when a couple of you did it, because you copied the exact same source. So not good. Plus, everything that I'm asking you weekly question wise, you can find the stuff directly in your textbook. Just look at the subject headings or look in the index and you'll find the stuff. It's there, I promise. And thing number three, I'm not sure you're completely aware that there's a review list for the quizzes. So I just wanted to, I'll show you that in a minute, just to remind you of that. You'll find that in the course documents page, Okay, so to recap, if you're going to turn something in really late, and I don't mean a day or two, or, you know, some of you, like you're really nervous folks and you turn in something half an hour late and then you email me, it's fine. 30 minutes, it's pretty much on time. I'm okay with that. 3 or 4 weeks, that deserves an email. So let me know why stuff is late. Don't cheat. Pay attention in class. Look at the lectures. They're taped. They're on the YouTube channel. There should be an announcement that it's probably one of the very first announcements that shows that the link to the YouTube channel. But I guess that's about it. All right. Let's look at the weekly, or the timed question, the quiz review. Okay. So quiz review, that's not yours. Let me try again. Okay. So sorry. 1302 weekly question. Oh, that's not it. Crud, where'd it go? All right. I must have opened. I must have closed it again. Dang it, Serna. Okay, it's down here. 1302, there's lecture, weekly question, timed question. Okay. Didn't show up. Darn it. One more try. I know, I'm sorry. I don't mean to mess this up. 1302, timed question review. I see it right there. Okay, gonna open it again. definitely not it. I don't know why it's not opening. Can I blame my computer for this? No, I cannot. All right. I will try one more time maybe, and then I'll give up. Okay. That is definitely not it. All right. We'll look at that at the end of class because somehow I'm jinxed on that. So we'll look at the weekly questions. Try this. Okay. Thank goodness. I don't know where that was. All right. So you have a list. This is in your course documents section of stuff to study to get you ready for the quiz. So if I were you, I'd study that stuff. It'll be helpful. So study the stuff, and the timed questions will be about these things, okay? So if you were not aware of that, then now you are. And I know I've said this before, I'm much more comfortable with you doing well on the weekly questions and having trouble on the quiz than I am with you doing well on the quiz, but having trouble with the weekly questions. Because my assumption is, you know, if you're doing well in the weekly questions, you're using the book, it's going, you know, that thing is good. Okay. All right. So, and the weekly questions, you've already done the New Nationalism and New Freedom one, and explain the reasons for participation in World War I, and we've talked about that probably more than you want to talk about. Describe the causes of the Great Depression, so that's kind of our discussion for today. Be specific and detailed in this discussion. What law or absence of laws might have set the conditions for this event? What were the government responses to the Depression before 1932, and were they effective? So when I'm asking that question, I'm asking very specifically, what did Herbert Hoover do to try to combat the Great Depression? So don't leave that out, okay? And then the next question is essentially, what does FDR do to combat the Great Depression? Identify the changes in American politics and society brought around by the New Deal, mention specific laws, philosophies, or politicians. And we'll talk much more about that next time. Okay. Uh-oh, something in the chat I'm ignoring. Okay. The quiz is the second weekly question number 7. You can turn in after spring break. In our discussion last week, unless I misinterpreted what you said, I thought that it was okay to go ahead, to go ahead and do the quiz before you go, because I think you'll have better luck on the quiz before spring break than you would after. And if you have an individual issue with that, you should individually let me know in an email so I don't forget. All right, let's talk about history. All right, let's do it. Okay. All right. So we've gone through all the 18th stuff. I feel like we've talked about why we went to World War I a bunch. And I think we started to talk about what's going on in the 20s and how we end up in the Great Depression. Okay. And I feel like we talked about all this stuff. So I don't know that we talked specifically about Sacco. And yeah, we did. Italian anarchists, we execute them even though we know they're probably not guilty. You've got Fordism, Fordlandia, you've got any industry that's related to the automobile doing pretty well. Workers' rights, yeah, we don't care anymore. Women, maybe a little, they're more liberal during this time period, but once you get to that getting married age, yeah, everything's fairly conservative again. And then the 30s will be a fairly conservative decade. Plus, I was going to say decade, but we're broke too. Really focused on partnership between the United States government and business. So pretty much any law that business wanted passed got passed during this time period, regardless of who the president was, whether it was Harding, then Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover is kind of the consistent thread of that legislation in this era because he is the Secretary of Commerce for the two presidents before him. So he's really tied to that prosperity of the 1920s, and then is going to be also tied to the Great Depression that begins in the 1920s. All right, so Coolidge president, religion is pretty trendy during this time period. I feel like we'd started to talk about this a little bit, so we'll try to breeze through this a little. This is the stuff that's probably going to help you on the quiz. Yes, the quiz. So fundamentalism is a big thing. You can read a lot about the Scopes monkey trial. You could find a book about it. This is a law passed in Tennessee. It's about a law passed in Tennessee, the Butler Act. A guy named Butler wanted to make sure everyone understood that he was the most spiritual guy running for office in Tennessee. So he passed a law that said it was illegal to teach the theory of evolution. There's really no intention of enforcing that law. I feel like we talked about this before. So the ACLU got a guy to teach evolution who was a little more of a sub, but he taught it, got arrested. They ended up with the trial, which they reenact every summer in Tennessee if you ever want to go see it. It's in Dayton, Dayton. And in the end, the guy's convicted of teaching evolution. He's fined $100. He says he'll appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. Gets overturned. The state says we're not doing that again. And it's really kind of a public battle between religion and science, or old principles and new principles, or country principles and city principles. Sort of, kind of. And the people who were really in favor of science and urban thought and modernism, that sort of stuff, proclaimed that fundamentalism, the literal belief in the Bible, was dead. And of course, people in the middle of the country would strongly disagree, and still would, and they would be correct about that as well, as you know, if you live in the middle of the country, which you kind of do. Also, pretty famous lawyers. You had Clarence Darrow for the defense and William Jennings Bryan for the prosecution. You may remember him as a presidential candidate, but he also was Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. And then Clarence Darrow is the most famous defense attorney of the time period. All right, the KKK is trendy during this time period. There's really 3 times in our history that the KKK is trendy. One is it's during Reconstruction. We've already studied that. So right after the Civil War. This is the other time. And then there's one more time. It's right after World War II, at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, and probably throughout. KKK is trendy because they say they want everyone to be an American. Now, I'm noticing as I'm grading your stuff that some of you are kind of catching a little of this in the discussion about Teddy Roosevelt. Somebody wrote about FDR and new nationalism. It's Teddy Roosevelt. It's 2 different guys. FDR is Teddy Roosevelt's nephew, I think it is, but they're related, but he's younger. Teddy Roosevelt, crud. Somebody was in their answer was writing about how racist he was, even though I said that he wasn't. And they kind of said that in the answer. It's like, I got it. Here's the thing about Roosevelt. Roosevelt desegregates the federal workplace and has African-American leaders to the White House and negotiates with them. But he's not, and you're fine if you said that, because I get it, and I do get it. I forget sometimes that I'm old, and I see this from a different perspective. And surely when you're reading his push for getting rid of hyphenated Americanism, which they do talk about, I mean, they don't necessarily call it that in the book, but there's really famous speeches where Teddy Roosevelt talks about how we should stop being, they didn't say African American back then, but Black American or Asian, they didn't say Asian back then either, or Italian American or Polish American, that we should just all be Americans. And there's a huge push, cultural push during that era for assimilation. And that assimilation is leaving your past culture behind. It's not a push that most people would be comfortable with in the modern era. And I'm not saying you know, like you shouldn't try to fit in, you shouldn't adopt the principles of the Constitution. Everybody understands that you're going to be more successful if you're fluent in English. I get all that stuff. But this was the idea that there needed to be one singular American culture and that we needed to be a melting pot. And there's some really weird videos from the time period, film, I guess is a better word, not video, where people, I think it's from a Ford company video, where they go into this tent wearing their cultural costumes from their home countries. And when they come out, they're all wearing like red, white, and blue. It wasn't color, but you can just sort of tell, stars and stripes, waving the American flag, that sort of thing. So the push pretty much for everyone during that era is figuring out how to fit in. So goodness. Roosevelt, for his time period, was probably pretty progressive on race. However, that time period was not very progressive about race. And even the arguments between the NAACP and guys like Marcus Garvey kind of reflected some of that as well. And I would never suggest to you that W.E.B. Du Bois is an accommodationist. My goodness, certainly that wouldn't fit at all. Or that he's big into cultural assimilation, because later on he's going to be the founder of the Pan-African movement. So he's definitely not that, but he is more about integration than separation and equal rights rather than separate rights, which I don't know, it's a long story, but we'll keep going on, maybe. But the KKK said everybody should try to fit in, learn English, family values, Bible, prohibition, that sort of stuff. And there's an emphasis on anti-communism. They have a really famous, very large march on Washington in 1920, where 50,000 people participate wearing their robes, but their hoods off. They're going to participate in the lynching of a Jewish fellow, Leo Frank, in Atlanta, who had been found not guilty of a crime of, he was an accountant at a factory, and somebody at the factory had been sexually assaulted and killed a very young girl. He was blamed for it. It turns out someone else did it. He was found not guilty, or was about to be found not guilty, or released by the judge. And then a mob of people went to the jail and took him out and killed him because they didn't want him to go free. And people made up songs about it and sang it. I mean, saying that it was, a rough time for sure. And all of this stuff was part of the popular culture. It wasn't necessarily seen as terrible. And then the leader of the KKK runs for president, and he's the runner-up in the nomination for his party, which was the Democrats during that time period. And then it turns out that he was an alcoholic who kidnapped a woman, raped her, and then raped her, damaged her so badly, like physical scars and that sort of stuff over the weekend of the kidnapping, that she found some medication, I can't remember what it was, that she took, and it caused her death. She just couldn't see an out and wanted to kill herself, and was able to find something they went to buy bandages and things to clean up her wounds, and it was mercury, that's what it was. She stole some mercury and consumed it and then died. And she told her story to a district attorney, assistant district attorney, I believe it was, before she died. And that became public later on. And what people found out is that the head of the KKK wasn't as nice a guy as he said that he was. So the KKK really kind of collapses in the 20s because the head of the KKK was guilty of being an alcoholic and a rapist, and leading to the death of this young woman. So it wasn't that he was the head of the KKK. Everybody knew that, and they were content to even let him run for president. But in that era, if you were a KKK member in the middle of the country, especially, it was helpful to you in politics. So that was pretty open. But when they found out that the KKK really wasn't as pristine and pro-American and pro-women and pro-prohibition as they claimed to be, then the KKK fell out of favor. They're also extremely anti-Catholic during this time period as well. So I don't know. I'm trying to think of the name. Is David Stevenson was the fellow, the KKK guy that ran for president, and I can't remember the name of the woman that he captured, that he kidnapped and raped, but that story was pretty prominent, and there's some stuff written about that as well, if you're really interested in reading a horrific story. But also interesting that the fact that the KKK was the KKK wasn't the problem. It was that the leader wasn't a Sunday school teacher. Goodness. And much more positive, interesting thing to read about during this era would be the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance occurs in the 1920s as well. And you see the rise of the NAACP, the Niagara movements, the founding movement that starts the NAACP. W.E.B. Du Bois, you could find biographies about him, fascinating fellow. First Harvard educated first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard. Certainly other folks had gone there before, but a brilliant fellow, great writer who wrote The Crisis, which was the NAACP's magazine, and is going to be involved in US politics for 40 or 50 years. So really important fellow, and lives a long time too. Also has a fairly public argument with Booker T. Washington about the nature of African-American education, whether it should be more classical education, whether it should be more practical, whether there should be a push for full integration, whether there should be a push for economic equality. So Du Bois would favor both economic equality and full integration. And Washington was more concerned about economic equality, or at least the ability to earn money. And also Du Bois is much more of a Northern fellow and Washington much more of a Southern fellow. So their ability to call on law enforcement or use the court system is going to be a little different. But the NAACP toward the end of the teens into the 20s will start to fight against the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson that declared that separate but equal facilities were legal. And this will be a 25 to 30-year fight that will start with desegregating things like medical schools and will eventually lead to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the desegregation of public school. All right, and the Harlem Renaissance, you've probably studied this a little bit before, maybe. I always wondered when I studied the Harlem Renaissance, like, why did this just happen? Was it an accident? Did everybody in the 20s go like, hey, we like jazz and the poetry is pretty cool, let's start buying it. And then when I got older, it's like, I've got time, I'll read some more stuff about it. And it's really sponsored by the NAACP and its contests. So people are able to win money, and the goal was to get people who were very talented to be able to quit their day job and become an artist, musician, writer, that sort of stuff for a living, and also to emphasize the contributions of African Americans to American culture. And it's the idea that African American culture is American culture, and it becomes much more accepted as part of American culture. If you study this movement a little bit more intensely, you'll also notice that, with the exception of Bessie Smith, who is a very famous singer during that era, almost all of the people who are involved, especially writers, are male, and a lot of the female writers, I know some of you go like, no, I know there's some female writers who were involved. You're correct. But their prominence really was it comes later, in part because some of the subject matter of the African American female writers isn't always complementary to African American men. So the men who led the movement pushed back on that a little bit. Lorraine Hansberry, I think, was a famous writer from the time period. There are a few more as well, and we'll talk more about that probably later. All right, but the Harlem Renaissance movement to emphasize African American cultural contributions, especially in art, music, literature, contests from the NAACP. Cotton Club becomes a really prominent jazz club where you hear Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington a lot. And it's sort of interesting that it used to be that this club was, had African-American audience, African-American musicians. And then as time went along, because it becomes more popular, they have nights where it's segregated. So it becomes kind of a whites only audience, which is a little ironic, isn't it? Or a lot ironic, but it does lead to the prominence of jazz, African-American culture becoming much more mainstream. I wouldn't see this as a big change in civil rights, because it certainly is not, but I would see it as more acceptance, at least cultural acceptance, of African-American art, music, literature as just American art, music, and literature. So, and that's kind of an emphasis by the NAACP, to kind of go along with that idea of assimilation. Because if the discussion is you don't want a separate culture, how is African-American culture not American culture? And that's going to be part of the discussion there. And I think too, as I look at my notes here, the end of the chapter where it starts on page 810, yes, that was page 810, is the part that really discusses what was going on during this time period economically. And I think I probably combined some of those notes with the beginning of the chapter 21 notes. So this first paragraph, but there's more. So if you look in your book on page 810, you'll notice more stuff. So some things we want to talk about as far as Great Depression. Now, they start with the election of 1928. Goodness, wrong year. 1928. But I do want to just remind you that there were problems with the US economy, and there were problems with the international economy. The problems with the US economy we'd already discussed. Anything related to the automobile seemed to be going well. Anything not related to the automobile, anything related to agriculture was not going well, even at the beginning of the 20s. There's also going to be overproduction of manufactured goods. So there's not a lot of inventory control. I know if you work at a store, all of the inventory, the reason that it's really important for you, like if somebody buys a thing of Coke, a thing of Dr. Pepper, and a thing of Diet Coke, instead of just scanning the one thing 3 times, they want you to scan each individual one, because that's how their inventory is done. One out, you want one back in, that sort of thing. They didn't have inventory control back then, and their communication wasn't good. They surely didn't have spreadsheets or computer communication, and they just kept producing more stuff than they were making. And the thought was always in the 20s, the economy will just continually get better and better and better. So we're overproducing, we're under consuming. There's also issues with stock during this time period. The stock market is booming, I suppose, for the time period. And people are buying and selling stock, and they're able to borrow money to do this. So they don't have to pay in cash. They can borrow money, and they can also borrow against the value of their stock without selling it. And part of that is called speculation. And there's also speculation. You can buy land sort of the same way. But if people are buying stuff, whether it's land or stock, and they're not actually paying for it, they're using borrowed money and people are charging interest for that, interest rates are going to continue to go up. Now, to cover the cost of those interest rates and some other stuff, the prices of things are going to go up. And if you can buy all these things without actually having money, the popularity of buying those things is also going to go up. So, between the inflation, between the interest rates, between the idea that you didn't actually have to have money to buy any of this stuff, there's kind of a stock market frenzy. So people can borrow money from their stockbroker. Their stockbroker has an interest in selling stocks. So they are going to sell a bunch of stocks that people aren't necessarily paying for. And you can borrow, some accounts that I read said that you could borrow up to 90% against the value of your stock. So let's say that I want to buy $100 worth of stock and I have 10 bucks. So I can buy $100 worth of stock. So I've only spent 10 bucks, but now I have $100 to play with. So I'm probably going to feel like, what do I have to lose? It's only 10 bucks, even though the value of what I have is 100. And then if somebody tells me, you know what? You have $100 worth of stock, you could borrow another 900 and then you'd have $1,000 worth of stock. I'm probably going to do it because I'm still in with 10 bucks and now I've got $1,000 worth of stock. So I borrow against what I borrowed to get. And my initial investment is tiny. So I'm going to do some pretty risky things because I can. So I do. And it doesn't take a whole lot of people doing that to cause a problem. Now, the source of these loans is banks. And the banks aren't regulated very well or at all, really, during that time period. And bank deposits aren't insured. Now, in that era, most people, a very small percentage of people bought stock. But a lot of people used banks and deposited their money in the banks. And the banks make more money if they loan the money out. That's, how they make interest money. So banks were just loaning money out like crazy with these really insecure or unsecure, it's both really, loans. And then when the stock market crashes, none of the people who borrowed the money can pay back their loans. And they mostly got their loans from the stockbrokers who got their loans from the bank. So if they can't pay the stockbroker, then the stockbroker can't pay the bank. And then the bank has loaned out all the money. So the people who just never bought stocks at all, but just put their paycheck in the bank, they go to get money out of the bank and it's not there and it's not insured. So they never get their money back. So the stock market crash is going to lead to a bank collapse, at least nationally. Internationally, there's also banking issues because international banks have secured loans for international stock markets, but also for German companies. And then when the German economy collapses and they have to completely redo their money, then the German economy can't repay the British and French economy, which can't repay the American economy. So you've got these series of international loans that cause problems as well. So there's international problems, there's the stock market crash, there's land speculation within the United States, and there's also just a lack of regulation of the economy. There's no laws or rules about what's required to borrow money. There's no insurance for bank deposits. There's no prohibition against borrowing on the margins or borrowing against the value of your stock without actually having to cash it in. You've got overproduction, which kind of goes along with underconsumption. Those two things kind of go together. You've got international stock and banking issues. You've got the collapse of the German economy, which leads to the collapse of some fairly unstable economies around Germany, including the large economies of France and England. And at this point, our economy has become more international. So if Germany, France, and England collapse and we collapse, it's an enormous problem. And it was an enormous problem. So you've got overproduction, you've got underconsumption, you've got a complete lack of regulation in the banking industry, in the stock industry. And you've got a government that, rather than checking the growth of business and making sure that the growth of business was truly legitimate and not based on these speculative entities or speculative actions, you've got a government that said, you know what, we just want the economy to continue to get bigger, whether it does so in a legitimate way or not. So we're going to work with businesses rather than check their growth or investigate them or make sure that their growth is real. So that combination of partnership between government and business, the lack of regulation, speculative loans, speculative stock market trading, speculation in the land market where people are able to borrow quite a bit and buy land that's probably not worth as much as they say. And because buying land and buying stock was really trendy, those prices were inflated. So it all kind of comes down at the same time. Now, they're going to tie this to the election of Herbert Hoover in 1928, not necessarily because the election caused it, but Hoover's going to run on the strength of the economy. And the guy that he runs against is Al Smith. Al Smith is from New York City. His family is immigrant family and he's Catholic. So that kind of plays into the Hoover is from the middle of the country. He's more of a real American. He's more assimilated. He also is more in favor of prohibition. Al Smith would have gotten rid of prohibition. So Hoover's much more American. He also can be tied to the prosperity of the 20s and the prosperity that was ushered in by the Republican Party. So he's really seen as more, the more bona fide, he did say bona fide a lot during that time period, bona fide true American candidate. But what you also see in this election is kind of interesting and follows a trend that we still see, that people in the cities, no matter who they are, where they're from, what they're like, tend to vote for Democrats, and people in the country tend to vote for Republicans. And that will continue to be a trend. It'll continue to be a voting trend. All right, so Al Smith, maybe because he seems pro-immigrant, because he's he's in favor of getting rid of prohibition, and because he's Catholic, and we're still not so keen on Catholics, except I know in the Southwest, things don't go well. So Smith loses, Hoover wins, and everybody just assumes everything will continue to go well, even though there were signs that things were not going well. So Hoover takes office in 1929, and that's the year of the stock market crash. So, and the stock market crash kind of helps usher in the Great Depression, and Herbert Hoover's got to deal with that. And part of your question is, how does Herbert Hoover deal with the Great Depression? I'm going to stop for just a second to see if you guys have any questions, and then we'll kind of go back to this. Is there anything you guys want to ask? Is there anything that you're thinking about that doesn't make sense, US history-wise? Plus, I've been talking too much. So I need a drink of water. Is there anything you guys want to ask? A really big piece of ice in there. All right, then. Yeah, we're definitely about to talk more about Hoover. Yep, that's where we're headed. So that's why I thought I'd take a little break and then we'll talk about Hoover. But yep, that's where we're headed. Ah, goodness. Did Hoover leave Americans out to dry? Well, he didn't think he did, but you'll have to decide that. He's going to do more to intervene in the American economy than any president has ever done before him. However, the guy who follows him does a lot more. So I think if you compare him to FDR, he's always going to look bad. He's probably going to look bad anyway, whether you compare him to FDR or not. But if you look at, how he intervened in the economy compared to people before him, it's, you know, it's more than people before him. However, it's not really going to be enough to make changes. Plus, he's going to do some stuff directly that's not effective. So we'll talk about that. Okay. All right. All right. We'll go back to the notes. The right notes. I was going to put up that, yeah, wrong class. Okay. So let me see. I'm sorry. Let me check and see. I don't really have a lot of the stuff in the notes, do I? But if you look on page oh my goodness, 814. If you look on page 814 in your textbook, then you will see the section called Hoover's Response. And that'll help you answer, sorry, Coke Zero. That'll help you, I'm gonna prove it to you. That'll help you answer the second half of the question. So Hoover becomes president, and some stuff that people are discussing as this Great Depression is starting to happen. You know, in 28, when he gets elected, that's Hoover. Everybody thinks, happy days are here again. Everything's great. Everything's going to be perfect. The economy is going to continue to grow. And then that's the year 29 when he takes office, is the year of the stock market crash. They closed the stock market several times before that to try to stop the fall. And I don't know how much attention you paid to the stock market, but we did that a few times last year as well to kind of, it's a normal process when the stock market falls a certain percentage. Now, because of regulation now, they stop it. Then they just thought, you know what, we got to stop this and maybe people will calm down over the weekend and then it won't continue to fall. So as the economy continues to worsen, there's a discussion of economic policy, and there's a discussion of some economic theory from a guy named John Maynard Keynes. So let me write his name in the chat. So let me move all my stuff here. So page 814. Okay, and then the economist is John Maynard Keynes. We only care about two economists in US history, and this is one of them. And his name looks like Keynes, but it's Keynes. His thought, he's a British economist, and his theory was that the only way to get out of a big depression, not the Great Depression, but certainly the Great Depression, would be for the government to spend money. And the government is the only entity that can really afford to spend money when it doesn't have money. If you're wondering, do we still think about this? Well, yeah. Are you watching the discussion about the stimulus bill right now, $1.9 trillion? Do we have $1.9 trillion? No. Is it important to spend it? It depends on if you're Keynesian, absolutely, because spending that money will jumpstart the economy. If you're not Keynesian, you're more conservative and economically, you're going to say like, no, we cannot afford to print money that we don't have or create finance that we don't have. We are not literally going to print money we don't have because you don't have to. But yeah, because all that stuff's economic now. But is this going to create a debt that we can never overcome? So these are concerns that people had then. These are concerns people still have now. And is the economy in such a dire strait that we've got to try to jumpstart the economy, or is it kind of on its way to slowly repair itself? Hoover also thought, because Hoover's kind of that middle of the country conservative sort of fellow, that if you give money to people, even in crisis, that they become one, dependent on the government, and two, lazy. And both of those things are immoral according to Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover doesn't want to do something that he thinks is immoral. He thinks that people should just try to spend less money and that businesses should just keep people on the payroll, whether they can afford to pay them or not. Because I guess Hoover didn't own a lot of businesses. So Hoover is also going to say that we don't need public charity, we need private charity. So rich people should help out and churches should help out. So he really thinks that churches, rich people, and businesses can kind of keep the economy going, that there's not really a need for a lot of public spending. But he is concerned that public spending, that social welfare, what we would think of as social welfare in the modern era, is going to make people lazy and dependent. So he doesn't want to do that. However, he is going to try to protect the American economy with tariffs. So one of the things that gets passed during this time period is the Smoot-Hawley tariff. I forgot I needed to type some more and brought my book back. So Smoot-Hawley tariff. And this is in 1930. We'll see if I spell correctly. Can never remember how many R's and F's there are in tariff. And this is 1930. So this is a protective tariff. So it charges import duties on imported goods. So we're trying to get people in the United States just to buy American stuff. And we're also trying to protect American exports. But other countries will do a similar thing and add tariffs to imported US goods. So this doesn't help. And the economy worsens after the Smoot-Hawley tariff. I would not suggest to you that it's necessarily the reason. I think we were already on that path. And what is typically true is that people in depressions don't go shopping. Now, I know there's some Amazon drivers that would probably disagree with that, and I know we haven't technically been in a depression, but typically we're in a strange economic time. We don't go shopping. And in this era, there wasn't as much credit. So, you can go shopping right now when you can't afford to. But even now, what they have discovered when they've tracked what happened with the economic stimulus is rather than go shopping or spending the money, a lot of people have paid off debt. So, paid up if they were behind on their house payment or their rent, or medical bills, and that of course makes sense. But the goal with the stimulus is to stimulate the economy, go shopping. So, all right, so the Smoot-Hawley tariff is passed, and then Hoover and the Congress, he doesn't do all this stuff by himself, of course, creates something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So we'll see if I can type that. So Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Reconstruction. Oh my gosh, I can't type. Finance Corporation. I don't know how it is I got this far in life without being able to type very well, but there it is. Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC. And the goal of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was to give money to banks and large businesses to keep them afloat so that they would keep their employees working. So you give the business money, and then the business will keep the people employed. They also created a federal home loan corporation that was supposed to do the same thing so that people would not lose their homes and they could refinance their mortgages, or they could continue to make payments, that sort of stuff. And they also made some public works projects. So they had a federal home loan. So these are all things that Hoover did in response to the Great Depression. So I'm going to be distressed with you if your answer is Hoover didn't do squat. What he did probably wasn't terribly effective, but do mention the things that he created. So Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Federal Home Loan Corporation, and Public Works Projects. Oh, I was thinking that I'm almost out of time, but this is the class with the famous 3-minute warning, which I appreciate. Okay, so public works projects, the most famous would be what's eventually called the Hoover Dam. Okay, all right. So they're going to spend a little money, more money than anyone had ever spent. But looking back from FDR, it's a little money. But from, oh my goodness, dang it. Okay, no, never mind. I spelled it right. So public works project, the most famous one was the Hoover Dam, and thousands of people went to work on this. It's a multi-million-dollar project, creates a consistent water supply for Southern Nevada, Northern California, some fairly important urban regions there as well. And it's the reason that Las Vegas becomes a big deal, because that's kind of in the middle of a desert, and without the Hoover Dam, they wouldn't have a consistent water source. So, just for the fact that people go to Vegas, maybe that's an important thing. But it was a sign that a public works project could be very helpful, but that was only helpful regionally. But Hoover and his administration were not very interested in expanding public works projects because the government was going into debt and they didn't want to go into any more debt. So even though they create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is supposed to help prop up businesses, what tends to happen is kind of what happened with the small business loan thing that happened in the Trump administration and is continuing in the Biden administration. I'm not trying to blame either president. I think it's just what happens. You make money available for businesses, larger businesses take that money and they reinvest it in themselves. They don't really hire more employees. So they don't hire more employees. They may not keep on more employees. And I know that the last bill tried to make it, the more recent one, tried to make it where what happened with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation didn't happen again, where people get loans and they keep it for themselves and it doesn't really expand the economy, but it's hard to work against that. Federal Home Loan Corporation probably benefited the banks more than the homeowners because it made sure that the banks didn't lose as much money. However, people still lost their homes in record numbers. And the Public Works Project helped a little in the regions where there were public works projects, but there weren't so many of them that it could be a national program that had helped a lot of people. And toward the end of the Hoover administration, there was a march of veterans. And it was called the Bonus Army or the Bonus March. There were a bunch of World War I veterans who had been promised that they would get kind of a bonus payment from their military service. What we found out is that the people who served in World War I did so at a time of great economic expansion, but they got paid very little money. So to make up for that, the thought was they would give them a bonus, but they would give them a bonus when they were older, like 60-ish. And that bonus would help pay for their old age, that kind of stuff. Because remember, most people didn't save for retirement. There wasn't Social Security, that kind of stuff. So it wasn't necessarily the government being stingy, but they promised them a bonus later. And then these folks say, you know what? We're broke now. We're losing our houses now. We can't feed our families now. So we don't want our bonus when we're 60. We need our bonus when we're 40. We need it now. So they spent all the money they had, went to Washington, D.C. and protested, but they protested in a fairly unusual way. They kind of camped out on the Capitol Mall, which is that space between all the monuments, but then they marched up to the Senate steps and they sang America the Beautiful. So it's not a very vicious protest. They sent in a representative to ask the Senate, hey, can we have our bonuses now? And the Senate said, we'd love to, but we're broke. So they said no. And then all those old veterans are kind of stuck there and they're a little agitated and they're broke and they can't get back home. So the Hoover administration, not necessarily Hoover, gets nervous because you've got all these ex-military or maybe still military, but probably ex-military guys hanging out near the Capitol and the White House, and they can't go home. So they're afraid there might be a rebellion. So, and Hoover ends up approving this, but they send the military out to disperse the veterans. So there's lots of video, and you can find this. I'll try to remember to put a link to it, But there's video of the current military going out to attack the veterans. And this happens in election year 1932. So you've got this terrible economy, and despite the RFC, Federal Home Loan Corporation, and public works projects like the Hoover Dam, the economy is just getting worse. And then you've got a president who keeps saying prosperity is just around the corner. Soon there'll be a chicken in every pot. Just hang on a little bit longer. The economy is going to fix itself. And then he sends troops out to shoot at veterans. And that's on the news. Now, they don't have television news, but you got to see newsreels before movies. And I know what you're thinking. One, is she still talking? Yes. And two, if they're broke, how are they going to movies? Well, movies were really, really cheap during that time period, and people couldn't go on vacation, so they went to movies. And sometimes the movies would have bingo, and you could win money. So people went to the movies because it was an escape, and you might be able to win money. Before the movies, they showed newsreels so you could see the news. So it wasn't like coming attractions or turn your cell phone off or whatever is shown before movies like any of us know anymore, but it was newsreels. So on all the newsreels, you got to see the military shooting at the veterans. Now, you weren't going to vote for Herbert Hoover anyway, because crud, even if you liked him, the economy collapsed and he didn't fix it. And honestly, before this, we didn't really expect the president to fix the economy, but dang, this is a big problem. So when you get a problem this big, this is when you start to think only the federal government can fix this. It's going to help you for the next question as well. So your mindset kind of changes about the responsibility of the government. And then you see the government really having an inept response plus shooting at veterans, and you go, we got to vote for the other guy. So they're going to vote for the other guy, no matter who the other guy is. And it turns out that the other guy is a pretty good politician. And not that Hoover hadn't been, but Hoover's response to this crisis, while unprecedented, still bigger than any other federal response before, didn't make a change. So people are not going to be satisfied, and it's not going to work out. Okay. Let's see. Oh, in the notes. Sorry, I was just noticing. In the notes, you have a little bit of stuff, Hoover stuff. So let me kind of highlight the Hoover stuff here. And I did forget to mention the Federal Farm Bureau. Federal Farm Bureau does the same thing as the Home Owners Loan Corporation, but for farms. So it's trying to make sure that farmers don't lose their farms. So they're going to refinance farms as well. So Hoover promised prosperity just around the corner. Government assistance would weaken the sturdiness of our national character, make people weak and lazy and dependent. Smoot-Hawley Tariff, 1930, makes stuff worse. RFC, Federal Farm Bureau. And again, in this question, don't say Hoover didn't do anything, but do mention that that things that Hoover didn't work well. I think that's a fair thing. All right, so is there anything else? Do you have any questions about Hoover? Is there anything else you would like to say about Hoover before we move on? Just a teeny tiny bit. I know we're getting close to 3-minute warning, but I think we're still, like 10 minutes away from 3-minute warning. I think we have time. All right. Let me see if I can find the Sarno. As hard as this was the first time. The 1302, dang it. I don't understand why this shows up the way it does. It makes me mad because I'm bad with technology. Okay, can you see the Unit 2 study sheet? Do you see that on your screen? I can't even see you guys anymore. What did I do? No. Okay, I'm going to try one more time. Thank you. All right. Am I sharing screen? No, not yet. Okay, there. I think I did it right because I see you guys on the right side. All right. So We just went over the chapter 20 stuff, and my neighbor's repairing something next door. So most of the stuff on the questions, and some of it is going to be related to the start of the Great Depression, because that fits in with your weekly question. But your list here, Sacco and Vanzetti, that's those two Italian anarchist immigrant guys that get tried for killing the paymaster at I think it's a shoe factory. Yeah, because the thing in Georgia is a pencil factory. The Scopes monkey trial, rural versus urban culture. So rural is going to be resistant to change. Rural is country, and urban is going to be probably more in favor of change, more comfortable with immigrants. Although assimilation is certainly still going to be a thing in an urban setting. The Harlem Renaissance, which is really trying to publicize more African American literature, art, that sort of stuff. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat. It's like, is this ever going to end? Pretty soon. We're almost there. Flappers and feminists. So you've got the women, the young women in particular, who are going to be more social. They're going to drink in public during Prohibition. They're going to wear less and less clothing. They may even talk about sex, that sort of thing. And this is going to be that age of woman that's between probably high school-ish, although most people didn't finish high school. So late teens up to the time they got married. And they probably got married early 20s, 22-ish during this time period, maybe a little bit later. The ERA is proposed during this time period to end discrimination on the basis of sex. It doesn't pass. Make sure you're aware of the presidents in the 20s. Harding, who is generally seen as corrupt and dies. Coolidge, who finishes his term and then gets one of his own and chooses not to run. The book talks about that. Coolidge is an interesting character, but if we had more time and you weren't already tired of listening to me, I would talk more about him. And then Herbert Hoover, who we talked about a lot today. I did not mention these folks, so I'll mention them really quickly. The Lost Generation, these are important writers of the time period, but they're kind of depressed and depressing writers. If you follow American literature, which whether you want to or not, your college courses make you, and your high school classes do as well. Hemingway and Fitzgerald both had trouble with alcohol. Both of them will die unnatural deaths. Hemingway commits suicide. Fitzgerald, I think Fitzgerald died of alcohol-related issues, and I think it was his wife that committed suicide. And Gertrude Stein is a pretty prominent writer of the time period that you probably study less. She's much more of a feminist writer during the time period. And then Ezra Pound, who's often known for his poetry, but writes some other stuff too. But these guys write about how the 20s culture is really kind of empty, how it's all about wealth. And you'll see similar reactions to the 50s culture and then to my teenage culture, the 80s culture, where it seems like there's this huge emphasis on you, your family, your personal wealth, and not so much the community surrounding you, to a point that it makes your world and your focus very small and very insulated. So these guys are sad that the promise of progressivism really wasn't fulfilled and really ends with this generation and with the 1920s. A lot of them become expatriates. They leave the United States. Mostly they go move to Paris because apparently everything is better in Paris, and live and work there. But they see the United States as becoming, too focused on traditional family issues, traditional religion, and not focused enough on, I wouldn't say global change necessarily, but at least, those progressive changes that protect workers' rights, and are more friendly to outside cultures. However, there's limits to these guys' vision of equality as well, and it doesn't include outside cultures that aren't Western European. So I know this is a consistent issue during this time period. The vision of racial equality or ethnic equality is not very well developed. That's the understatement of the day. Understatement of the day. All right. And then next time, we'll talk about the New Deal, that sort of stuff. And I'll tell you which agencies that I think you should study. In case one of you just really wants to take the quiz tonight at midnight, I wouldn't, but you do whatever you want to do. Especially study, because there's literally 100 New Deal agencies, especially study the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the NRA, which is not guns, National Recovery Act or Administration. Two of those, AAA and NRA, get declared unconstitutional, which is part of the reason that I want you to look over those. Also, don't forget to look at the list of other stuff from the previous chapters as you start to prepare for the quiz. What did you want me to type in the chat? Oh, the AAA probably. CCC, NRA for the quiz. And these are New Deal agencies. And it's about to show up because I'm almost done. Is that what you wanted me to type in the chat? I wasn't reading the chat, was I? All right. You're welcome. All right. I hate to finish early and miss out on the 3-minute warning, but I did want to see if you guys have any questions before we go. And then I want to double check the roll because I think I missed some of you on the way in. So, all right, chat's still up. I think stop the recording.